I found a woman's wedding ring under the seat of my husband's car. He said it meant nothing, but my heart knew he was lying. I never imagined the darkest truth would lead me to someone from my own family. My name is Orenda Blackwolf. I'm a wildlife photographer. I always trusted my family, until one of them destroyed everything I believed. The morning light was harsh, streaming through the open garage door and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had decided to detail Elias's SUV, a gesture of affection before our long-planned trip to the mountains. The interior was littered with the remnants of his frantic week. Old coffee cups, crumpled receipts, and the stray debris of a life lived too fast. As I slid the vacuum nozzle under the passenger seat, something metallic caught the morning sun. I reached down, expecting a coin or a lost pen, but my fingers closed around a delicate gold band. It wasn't mine. It was an intricate thing, set with a small singular sapphire that caught the light with an accusatory glint. I held it in my palm, the metal feeling cold and heavy, a physical weight that seemed to anchor itself to my soul. When Elias came into the garage, his smile was easy, practiced. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes scanning the space, then landing on my hand. I held up the ring. The color drained from his face instantly, replaced by a rigid, artificial calm. "It must have been there for ages," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Probably belonged to the previous owner, or maybe a client I drove last month. It doesn't mean anything, Orenda." He reached for it, but I pulled back. The instinct to protect the truth, whatever it was, suddenly overwhelming. His explanation felt hollow, a flimsy screen placed in front of a raging fire. I didn't push. I didn't scream. I simply slipped the ring into my pocket and nodded, the silence between us growing thick and suffocating. That night, while he slept, I stared at the ceiling, the sapphire burning a hole in my pocket. The first crack in the foundation of my life, beginning to spiderweb across my vision. The following days were a study in dissonance. Elias continued his routines, but they were tainted now, punctuated by the sharp, sudden vibration of his phone tucked away in his jacket pocket. I saw him retreat to the porch to take calls, his posture hunching, his voice dropping to a low, melodic murmur that I realized with a jolt I had never heard him use with me. It was a conspiratorial tone, intimate and guarded. I started to look at the past few months differently. I remembered the odd cancellations of dinner plans, the way he would suddenly need to go to the office on a Saturday evening, and the way he had become protective of his laptop. It had been easy to dismiss as professional stress, the burdens of a corporate life I rarely understood. Now every small lie felt like a loose thread on a sweater. If I pulled just one, I feared the whole garment would unravel. I found myself watching him, not with the eyes of a loving wife, but with the detached, analytical focus of a photographer waiting for a rare animal to step into the light. I began to notice patterns. A specific ringtone, a flicker of nervous energy when he checked his messages, the way he glanced at the door whenever the phone chimed. The dread began to set in, a cold, creeping sensation that someone I knew, someone close, was at the center of this web. It wasn't just an affair. The secrecy felt too calculated, too involved. I was living in a house of mirrors, and every reflection I saw of my husband was distorted, a version of him that I didn't recognize. The fear was no longer that he was being unfaithful, but that the betrayal was coming from a place so close to home that it threatened to collapse my entire sense of belonging. Seeking a reprieve from the stifling atmosphere of our home, I drove to see my cousin, Serafina. She had always been the sister I never had, the one I turned to when the world felt too heavy. As we sat on her patio, the familiar scent of jasmine hanging in the air, I felt a desperate need for the comfort of her presence. I mentioned the trip I had planned, casually bringing up Elias's name. The change in her was instantaneous. She stiffened, her tea glass rattling against the table as she set it down a little too hard. She began asking rapid, pointed questions about when exactly we were leaving and which route we were taking. When Elias called my phone a moment later, I didn't answer, but I watched her face. Her eyes darted to my screen with a raw, panicked intensity that made my stomach churn. "Is something wrong, Serafina?" I asked, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. She stammered a response, blaming a migraine, her hand trembling as she smoothed her hair. There were no words, but the space between us was filled with a thick, pulsating tension. I watched her glance at her own phone, then back at me, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal a look of profound, desperate guilt. It was a look I had seen before, reflected in the small, panicked movements of a trapped creature. I stood up to leave, the pleasant afternoon feeling like a staged play. As I walked to my car, I could feel her watching me from the porch, her silence screaming that she knew far more than she was ever meant to reveal. The drive home was a blur of gray highway. I couldn't stop my mind from circling back to the image of her face. That night, when Elias finally fell into a deep, drug-like sleep, I opened my laptop and began to dig into the digital debris of our lives. I waded through old photos from family gatherings, the ones from years ago, long before I had even met Elias. I found a group photo from a summer party at my parents' house, back when Serafina and I were just finishing university. There in the background, half hidden by a tree, was Elias. He was standing with his arm around a young woman who looked hauntingly familiar, the same sapphire ring on her finger. They were laughing, a look of profound, secret intimacy etched on their faces. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. My hands shook as I zoomed in on the pixelated image. They hadn't just met. They had a history, one that spanned years, one that was clearly alive and well while I was busy falling in love with a man who had never really been mine. I looked at the photos of our wedding, the ones I had cherished for the last 3 years, and saw them differently. Serafina was in every shot, standing near the altar, her smile tight, her eyes always tracking Elias. The betrayal wasn't just a recent lapse. It was a long con, a carefully constructed life built on the foundations of my family's trust. Every happy memory I had was now a lie, a carefully curated performance for an audience of one. I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing, and the realization made me feel physically ill. The following week, the silence grew into a weapon. I became a ghost in my own house, moving with calculated invisibility. I told Elias I was going on a photography assignment in the city, but instead, I circled back and parked 3 streets over from the coffee shop where I knew Serafina worked. I waited for 2 hours, my camera bag heavy on the seat beside me, until I saw Elias pull up. He didn't go inside. He waited in his car, and a moment later, Serafina emerged, sliding into the passenger side. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. I watched from a distance as they drove to a secluded park on the edge of town, a place I had told them I loved years ago. I watched them walk into the woods, their hands locked together, their bodies pressed close in a way that left no room for doubt. I didn't take the photos. I didn't need evidence of the physical act. I needed to know the extent of the rot. I stood in the shadow of a massive oak, listening to the muffled sound of their voices through the trees. They were talking about money, about the house I had inherited from my grandmother, and how they were planning to use it as collateral for a business venture that would leave me with nothing. The words drifted through the air, cold and transactional. They weren't just lovers. They were partners in a scheme to strip me of everything I owned. I slipped away before they could catch a glimpse of me, my body moving on autopilot, my mind a hollow shell of shock. I wasn't weeping. I was beyond tears. I was cold, crystalline, and terrifyingly clear. The collapse of my world was absolute, yet the shards were sharp enough to cut through the fog. I discovered, through a quick check of the joint accounts I had been too trusting to scrutinize, that Elias had been bleeding our savings dry for months. He had opened a line of credit in my name, funneling the funds into an offshore account that Serafina had helped him set up. It was all there, the paper trail of my own undoing. This wasn't just an affair of the heart. It was an affair of greed, a calculated dismantling of my future. I sat on the floor of my office, surrounded by the prints of the landscapes I had spent years capturing, and felt the weight of the betrayal. It wasn't just the husband who had failed me. It was the cousin I had called sister. I realized then that my silence was a form of complicity. If I was to survive this, I would have to be the one to orchestrate the ending. I made a vow then, not to them, but to the woman I used to be. I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't let them know how much they had shattered me. I started to play the part of the devoted wife with a terrifying precision. I smiled when Elias kissed my cheek. I laughed at his dry, humorless jokes. I continued to pack for the trip we were supposedly taking. Beneath the surface, I was a hive of activity. I was downloading statements, copying private messages, and documenting every transfer of funds. I felt no anger, only a chilling, efficient need for justice. The anger would come,